Katie, we've been talking a lot about what an analyst is and does, and an interesting question that's come up for me that I hadn't actually really given much thought to before is what's the difference between an industry tech analyst and a consultant?
Yeah, there's a little bit of apples and oranges and a little bit of apples and apples here. There's definitely a Venn diagram in these things. And, a lot of times a tech industry analyst most of the time is going to be a little bit more focused on the market and understanding, like usually each analyst sort of oftentimes has a market that they focus on, and their job is to understand who's the players, and what the landscape looks like. And then again, oftentimes sizing it, forecasting it, we're expected to have a little bit of knowledge from the end user perspective around, implementation of technologies, and especially in enterprises. But that's kind of where typically you would see more of a consultant take over, right? Oftentimes consultants have either they align with, say, maybe a particular vendor or set of vendors that they're specialized in implementing, and they'll work kind of one-on-one with an organization, helping them get that, say, up and running, or a program up and running in an organization. And that's kind of where analysts and consultants typically diverge, although, it's not always. Sometimes you kind of see a mix of the both, but more often than not, we're looking kind of more at the bigger picture rather than the actual, stand it up in an organization.
So would you say a general way to differentiate the two is you might go to an analyst to ask about what types of technologies to use or implementations or what the trends are, and then you might go to a consultant to actually implement the one that you decide to go with?
Bingo. Yep, 100%.
So if I'm trying to find an analyst or a firm to help my company, one of the things you and I have talked about is, there's an analyst for everybody. It's kind of, maybe like picking a therapist to some extent. You have to find a good match. So how do you figure out if a firm is a good match for your company?
Yeah, I think, like we said, there is a lot of different flavors, without talking about all of them, at least say for like IDC, right? We're generally known for being very data oriented. So a lot of times people come to us in particular for things like, say, market sizing or forecasting, or even survey research is, we're sort of the international data company, right? That's what we're known for. And I think that's one of the first things, right, is kind of understand what it is that you're looking to get out of working with an analyst firm. Some are really good at, say, content creation and promotion. Maybe they do a lot of TV. They're often, say, interviewed on like news networks, or there's others that have like really large social media followings. There's others that are known for working really closely with practitioners or end users versus vendors. So I think it's kind of understanding what it is that you're trying to get out of working with an analyst. And I think one of the most important things is to just get in front of analysts and sort of figure them all out. Almost every analyst firm will take a briefing from a vendor or a question from a practitioner, and like have that sort of initial conversation with someone, sort of, just without any exchange of dollars, right? And I think just kind of getting out there and seeing all of the different analyst firms and talking to them, and then understanding in that conversation what sort of their point of view and their specialty is, and then align that with what you're trying to get out of that relationship with an analyst or an analyst firm.
Yeah, that makes sense. And like, as I'm potentially evaluating analyst firms, or if I'm a vendor, talking to a firm about my product, something you said is being a good analyst requires you to be able to ask good questions. What are some examples of what that can look like if I'm, trying to figure out if an analyst is going to, be a good fit for me?
Yeah, I think one of the markers of a great analyst, and I see this in my peers. I remember when I started as an analyst, I would pick up right away on my peers that were always asked really good questions, and I think that's really how an analyst, how you know that they're like making those connections and understanding things. And I think the analysts that really force vendors to like connect dots across like strategy, execution, outcomes, technology, and understand all of those things are usually the best analysts. So, you know, I find like one area in particular is, for me, I like to always ask a vendor's point of view on the competitive landscape. Oftentimes, because sometimes they'll mention somebody that I wasn't even aware of, and it'll give me some additional information. But oftentimes, I think a vendor that understands the landscape and their competitors is usually a signal that they sort of better understand how their technology is actually solving a problem, because they have a good insight into how they fit in sort of the whole. I always say there's never a market of one, right? You're never, as much as people like to create categories, until you have competitors, like you don't have a market to operate in. So I think that's a question that I don't always hear other analysts asking, and that I've learned from peers, is like, hey, well, who do you see as your competitors? And 9 times out of 10, if I get we don't, we win every POC we're in, or our number one competitor is, I always get the in-house, like, oh, they have an in-house solution. Nobody has a technology here. And I'm like, no, I don't know that that's usually always the accurate answer, right? But yeah, I think analysts that can get at those hard, ask those hard questions respectfully, right? I think that's another point. There's analysts that are known for just like asking tough questions for the purpose of asking a tough question and not trying to actually get something out of that conversation, which I don't know is always the right approach. But yeah, good questions are definitely a marker, I think, of a good analyst.
Yeah, but like a job interview, you kind of have that question you ask everyone. So something we're going to get into in the upcoming Lean AppSec is myth busting. And one of the topics we're going to talk about is the myth that analysts are pay to play. So we're not going to talk about that specifically, but I'm curious, why do you think that myth is so pervasive? Why do people think analysts are pay to play?
Yeah, I think I mean, just like anything, it's, these sort of things persist no matter how much evidence there is to the contrary. I think some of it is to the point of there's a lot of people that don't interact with analysts at a company, and they don't even know what analysts do. And so there's this transparency issue, right? That like, if I'll give the example of like the quadrant evaluations and stuff like that. Oftentimes all the public sees is that chart, and they don't have, the reports that go behind it and the methodology. A lot of that stuff's often, say, behind a paywall or, for client access. And so there's sometimes that lack of transparency there, just because of the way this industry operates. I think sometimes works against us, in that you just like look at this and everybody has their opinions about where they think things should be, and assume that when they don't have transparency into, say, the methodology of something, it's easy to question it. And I also think there's this idea of like a visibility bias, right? The one thing I have really learned is there are companies that value relationships with analysts and those that don't. And that's, that's okay. It's whatever your strategy is. But obviously companies that brief analysts more are naturally going to appear in research, and that can be misinterpreted as causation, right? I talk, generally, again, briefings are just, you don't have to be a client of an analyst firm to request a briefing and talk to an analyst about what you're doing. And especially for startups and smaller companies, a lot of them don't even realize that. And And then I'll publish some research and they'll say, oh, well, why wasn't I included in this? And I was like, well, have you ever briefed me? You've never talked to me before. So I may have caught on to you by my own research, scrolling through the internet and LinkedIn and stuff like that. But until I have had the opportunity to speak with you and ask questions and learn more about your technology, it's hard to include you in research, right? So it is a two-way street in that you as a vendor have to get yourself in front of analysts. And so if your company doesn't have a strategy, you don't have an AR function or somebody managing those relationships with analyst firms, there's that you just aren't in front of them as much as somebody else is. And that has nothing to do with money, right? Or pay to play.
Yeah.
So, and I think, like I said, there's just skepticism. It's a long held belief, and those kinds of things are sometimes hard to crack, no matter how much evidence you give to the contrary.
I want to talk about tech now. I don't know what your last 3 weeks have been like, but mine have certainly been a little crazy because of all the NPM supply chain attacks. It's on everyone's mind right now. Everyone's talking a lot about like malware. Based on who you're talking to and what you're seeing, do you think that we're on the cusp of any kind of a change in the industry in terms of how we handle malware, both from an ecosystem perspective, what will Microsoft, what will GitHub do about NPM, but also on the consumer side about proactive and reactive risk management for malware? There's a lot of commentary that it hasn't been prioritized because there's no regulations about it in the way that there are for CVEs, for example. So long story short, do you think things are going to change?
Yeah, it's tough to say. I started as an analyst right before Log4j happened, and it was really interesting to see how that did spur, I think, a lot of activity. But I almost like when thinking about particularly the software supply chain, a lot of times it's like you get this peak and then it sort of dies off, to the exact point you made, that when like actual sort of regulation doesn't come behind it. Because I will say, like, good intentions are great, but in every survey I've done, every conversation I've had, the things that are like required are the things that top the list, right? If there is some sort of negative outcome, whether that be like a liability or compliance related things, tend to drive action more than like a big security incident. Even I've seen in my survey research where I've asked if like you've had an internal security breach or something like that, and that still isn't ranked as high in terms of like drivers of change than things like I have some compliance regulation that I have to follow. And so, to your point, I think there has to be some sort of ecosystem shift for this to be more than just like a big marketing event that vendors tack onto and use to say like, this is how we could have solved it. Because oftentimes that is what these sort of large incidents end up being. And then more so than driving, say, like purchasing dollars from an actual organization. And it's sad to say, but I mean, I even still today, I've been talking about software supply chain security for over 3 years now. And in my last survey I ran in July, it was just about 50% of the organizations I surveyed take less than 14% of their overall AppSec budget towards software supply chain security. Now, what's the right percentage? I don't know the answer to that question, but that's still overall for where we're at seems, fairly low investment wise. So I do think I'm always hopeful that these things will be a reality check for people, but oftentimes it ends up more becoming marketing messaging for vendors than it is a driver of more money being spent on something from those that are purchasing.
Well, I did see a blog this morning from GitHub about changes coming to NPM. So hopefully the ecosystem side is shifting.
Yeah, it's got to come from the ecosystem. There's got to be, you know, I often talked about like with Log4j when that attestation form came out and there wasn't the requirement for SBOMs on there, I often joked like it was like, you know, the SBOM rocket's still going to the moon, but like a booster fell off, you know, in the launch. It's just not going to get there as fast when there's not somebody holding folks accountable. Unfortunately, it's like either compliance or some sort of legal, you know, liability tends to have to be the thing that actually drives, you know, change. I'll be interested to see like the CRA in Europe and how some of those things change if they do the ecosystem here. But oftentimes like you know, this whole recent NPM thing is not likely to just like all of a sudden have everybody out there caring about malware, caring about open source security, at least to, you know, where they're spending large amounts of money on it.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to look at maybe like the next 6 months with it being September now, budget cycles, you know, starting over, whether anything changes. Okay, ASPM.
Yeah.
You have done a lot of work on that. I've, you know, been working in this particular slice of the industry for a couple of years now, and I think ASPM is the category that has the most, I'll say a mix of confusion. People don't know what it is. Derision / hate. People seem very angry about it sometimes, and also adoption. So like it's a very interesting category to me. What's your like most succinct definition of ASPM?
Yeah, that's a tough because my actual definition is like 3 paragraphs in like written definition. But generally, how I see it is, I think the short and long of it is really it's the definition of security posture management that matters. The A, and we have lots of XSPMs, right?
Yeah.
To me, the way I interpret it is the A is the lens at which we're looking at risk, or what we're looking at the risk of what, right? And SPM is the process, and that is that sort of like continuous contextual risk-based approach to managing, you know, security, and in this case around the application. And so how that's typically done is it's this combination of ingestion of security issues and findings and data. There is this effort of sort of aggregating, normalizing, correlating, and then prioritization happens. And then from that prioritization, there is then risk or remediation that comes after that, right? So it's sort of those 3 key pillars that these platforms are driving. And in this case, it's all around applications, because oftentimes we'll get into debates like, oh, well, do you include identity? Is the software supply chain part of ASPM? What about AI? And it's like all of those things can matter in the context of an application if they're in some way connected to it. Just like the infrastructure and cloud security, all of those things can have an effect or an influence on the security of an application. So it's looking at all of that data through the lens of application risk, I guess.
And your unique application, right?
Yeah.
Why do you think there are so many strong opinions about this category in particular?
Yeah, it is very, having coming out of evaluating it, it is very competitive. And actually I wrote this blog on LinkedIn, and I think you read it, Jen, around tying ASPM to Romeo and Juliet, harkening back to my English major roots. But it really is this like, there is this like Capulet and Montague situation going on in this space in particular, because there's a lot of folks coming out and saying like, what is the true or right way to do ASPM? If I came away with any finding from this whole research, is that I don't think that there is one one way. You know, there's this kind of artificial line in the sand that's been drawn, particularly between like, do you have a scanner or do you not have a scanner? Are you an aggregator? Are you, you know, sort of a more closed loop application security platform? And any flavor in between. There's definitely a spectrum there, right? And I think ultimately what I've taken away is it's much more about the organization, their tech stack, and what their particular application risk management problem is, that is what will point you towards a particular type of ASPM solution. Ultimately, whether you have scanners or not does not, like when I talk about ingestion, it doesn't matter if the platform you're using itself is generating those security findings or you're getting them from another tool. There are certain advantages and disadvantages that, you know, would be a whole nother conversation on, you know, say data fidelity and those kinds of things that you can get into with whether you're scanning or you're not scanning. But ultimately, it's about the organization, their profile, their tech stack, and what they're looking to achieve outcome-wise. That does not matter. So I think there's, for whatever reason, one, I think because of a lack, there have been very few that have come out, neutral third parties that have come out and said, this is what ASPM is or should be. And so it's sort of created a lot of infighting of, you know, a vendor, obviously a vendor is going to position their approach to ASPM as the right approach. I mean, that's
how it works. Yeah.
That's how it works, right? And so that's part of really why I undertook doing the evaluation. I totally happy to argue with people and always take other people's opinions on those kinds of things, because I recognize that being one of the first to put an opinion out a lot of times puts you in interesting territory, and I'm not always going to be right and willing to absolutely have those or I guess I'll say is my opinion is not the end all be all. It is a opinion in the ecosphere of opinions, right? But somebody's got to have one. So that's what I was trying to do, is kind of make sense of this very, not only competitive, but really crowded market. You know, in my research, I looked at almost 20 vendors, but that was narrowed down from a list of like 37, I think.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah.
Neat. Well, it's super interesting. I'm looking forward to our longer conversation on analyst myths. Thanks for sitting down.
Yeah, happy to be here.